Winter, 1878. High in the Colorado Rockies. Buried under snow so deep the outside world had stopped existing. For 3 days straight, the giant of a man never left her bedside. Her fever broke. Clara's eyes opened, and there was Silas Boone, big and scarred, still gripping her hand like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. Stop. It's too much, she trembled, shaking with the fear of letting someone in for the first time in her life. He pulled her into his arms, and the walls around his heart came crashing down. Then the giant cowboy growled, "You drive me out of my mind." But weeks earlier, this same man had looked at her and seen nothing but a $500 bounty. So what changed him? And can it survive what's still coming for them both? Stick around for the full story and hit subscribe. The wind came down off the mountain like something with teeth. Silas Boone heard it before he saw anything else. A sound underneath the wind. Small, almost nothing. He stopped. Rifle still raised toward the wounded elk he'd been tracking since dawn, and turned his head. There it was again. A voice, thin and cracked, calling for help. He left the elk. Let it limp off into the white. A man who'd spent 6 years hunting other men for money learned to trust that thin sound faster than he trusted his own eyes. And right now his eyes were showing him nothing but snow falling sideways and a sky the color of a bruise. He found her 30 yards past the tree line, half buried, one arm flung out over a leather satchel like she'd rather freeze than let go of it. Her lips had gone the color of ash. Her dress, what he could see of it under the snow, was city cloth. Wrong cloth for these mountains. Wrong everything. Silas knelt down, pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse, weak, but there. He should have left her. That thought came to him, plain and simple. No shame attached to it. A stranger this deep in the mountains in the dead of winter meant trouble. And trouble was the one thing Silas Boone had promised himself he was done with. He'd built this life brick by brick, snowdrift by snowdrift, specifically so nobody would ever come knocking. He had exactly $140 saved toward the deed for this mountain. Enough men had died by his hand that he figured he'd earned the right to disappear. Then he looked at her face again, and something in him went cold in a different way. He knew her. Not personal, not by name, not yet. But he'd seen that face 2 weeks back, nailed to a post outside the trading post in Silverton, printed rough on cheap paper. Wanted, it said, $500, offered by Gideon Frost. For a woman, alive, no questions asked. $500. That was more than 3 times what he had saved. That was the deed to his mountain. Clear and final. No more scraping by on elk meat and trapped rabbit. That was every winter after this one settled easy. Silas looked down at her a long moment. The wind screamed past his ears. Somewhere behind him, his horse stamped and snorted, impatient with the cold. He didn't feel good about what he did next. He wants that said plain. He didn't scoop her up out of some notion of chivalry. Didn't tell himself he was doing right. He picked her up because a dead woman was worth nothing to Gideon Frost, and a live one was worth $500. And Silas Boone had long since stopped, pretending he was a better man than his ledger said he was. She weighed almost nothing. That surprised him some. For a woman worth that kind of money, he expected more fight in her, more substance. Instead, she felt like carrying a bundle of kindling, all sharp angles and cold. Her fingers, when they brushed against his forearm, were blue at the tips. He brushed the snow off her face with the back of his hand, just to see her better. Just to be sure she was the one from the poster, and not some other lost soul he was about to drag a mile uphill for nothing. It was her, the nose, a little crooked, like it'd been broken once and healed wrong. The scar through her left eyebrow. Small details. The kind a wanted poster gets right when the man drawing it up wants his money bad enough. Silas carried her the rest of the way without a single soft word for her. He talked plenty on the walk, but only to himself, muttering about deeds and money and how he was going to buy himself the kind of solitude a man could die peaceful in. He didn't call her by name, didn't know it yet, and told himself he didn't care to. The cabin came into view through the trees. its chimney sending up a thread of smoke that the wind tore apart before it climbed 10 feet. Silas kicked the door open with his boot and carried her straight to the cot by the hearth, laying her down the way a man sets down a sack of grain, careful enough not to spill it. Nothing more. He built the fire up high, peeled off her frozen outer layers with hands that had done far worse things than this and felt nothing while doing it, wrapped her in the one good wool blanket he owned. Then he sat down across the room, rifle across his knees, and watched her breathe. $500, he thought, watching the rise and fall of her chest like it was the only interesting thing left in the world. He told himself he was keeping her alive for the bounty. Told himself that was the whole of it. Simple arithmetic, nothing complicated. A prisoner, not a guest. That was the word he used in his head. Prisoner. Outside, the storm kept coming down, burying the valley, burying the trail behind them, sealing the two of them inside that one small cabin with nothing but a fire and a locked door between them and the rest of the world. Silas didn't know yet what she was carrying in that satchel. Didn't know her name was Clara, or that the book she'd nearly died protecting held enough truth to bring down a man far more dangerous than any bounty he'd ever collected. He only knew one thing for certain, sitting there in the firelight with his rifle across his knees. She wasn't going anywhere till spring. Clara woke to firelight and the smell of wood smoke, and for a moment she thought she was dead. Then her whole body ached at once, a deep bone ache that told her she was very much alive. And she remembered the snow, the cold that had stopped being cold and turned into something warm and dangerous. The way her legs had quit working somewhere past the tree line. She remembered a hand, big rough, brushing snow from her face. She sat up too fast and the room spun. A cabin log walls, a stone hearth throwing orange light across the floor. Shadows stretched long and huge against the far wall. And thus filling up half the room, it seemed. A man. He was the biggest man she had ever seen outside of a circus poster. Shoulders like a doorframe, a beard gone rough and unkempt, streaked here and there with gray he hadn't earned from age alone. A scar cut through one eyebrow and another ran along his jaw, pale against the weathered brown of his skin. He sat in a chair across the room, a rifle laid over his knees, watching her the way a man watches weather rolling in, patient, unbothered, waiting to see what it would do. Clara's hand found the little table beside the cot before her mind caught up to what her body already knew to do. Her fingers closed around a glass vial, one of the small medicine bottles from her satchel, and she brought it down hard against the table's edge. It shattered clean, leaving her holding a jagged length of glass, and she held it out in front of her with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Don't come near me," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. She hated that it cracked. The big man didn't move, didn't even lean forward. "Wasn't planning to," he said. His voice matched the rest of him, low, unhurried, like it came from somewhere deep in his chest and had all the time in the world to get out. He set the rifle down against the wall, slow, both hands visible the whole time. And then he did something Clara didn't expect. He raised his palms. "You're in my cabin," he said. "You were near dead in the snow when I found you. I brought you in. I got a fire going, and that's the whole of what I've done to you. Nothing else." Clara's eyes darted around the room. One door, shut tight against the wind that still howled outside. One window, shuttered. No other way out that she could see. And her legs, when she tried to shift her weight, felt about as useful as wet rope. "Who are you?" she said. Silas Boone. The name meant nothing to her, and that surprised her some, because everybody in Silverton had a story about somebody, and she'd made it her business the last 2 years to know most of them. A stranger this deep in the mountains who wasn't known to her at all. That was either very good luck or very bad. "You a Pinkerton?" she asked. Something crossed his face at that. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one, gone before it fully arrived. No, working for Gideon Frost. This time he did go still. Just a fraction. Just enough that Clara caught it and filed it away. He didn't answer right off. He looked at her a long moment. And Clara had the uncomfortable sense of being read like a page in a book. Some column of figures he was working out in his head. "Eat something," he said instead. You've got frostbite starting in 2 fingers, and you haven't got the strength yet to hold that glass steady, let alone use it on anything. He rose from the chair, slow, and Clara's grip on the glass tightened until it bit into her palm. But he didn't come toward her. He crossed instead to the hearth, where a pot hung over the fire, and ladled stew into a tin plate. Then he walked it over, not to her hands, but to the small table at the foot of the cot, well within her reach and well outside of his. He set it down, stepped back, sat down again in his chair on the far side of the room, putting the whole width of the cabin between them. Clara stared at the plate, then at him. "You're not going to make me put that down," he said, nodding at the glass in her hand. "And I'm not going to make you eat. Do what you need to do to feel safe. I've got nowhere to be." It was such a strange thing to say that Clara almost laughed, except laughing right then felt like it might turn into something else entirely, something closer to weeping. And she didn't have room in her chest for that on top of everything. She ate with one hand and kept the glass in the other for the better part of an hour. And Silas Boone sat across the room and mended a torn piece of harness leather like she wasn't even there. Like a half-frozen fugitive holding broken glass in his own cabin was an ordinary Tuesday evening. He didn't ask her name, didn't press her on Gideon Frost again, didn't so much as glance her way more than once every few minutes. Quick checks the way a man might check on a simmering pot, making sure nothing had boiled over. By the time she'd scraped the plate clean, her hand had started to ache from gripping the glass so hard, and slowly, without deciding to, she let it lower. "You could have taken that from me any time you wanted," she said. "Could have. Why didn't you?" Silas didn't look up from the leather in his hands. "Because you're scared, and you got reason to be scared, being where you are, with who you're with. And taking that glass wouldn't have made you less scared. It would have just made you scared and unarmed both." Clara turned that over in her mind. It didn't sound like something a bounty hunter would say, and something in the careful way he'd said it told her he'd chosen the words on purpose, like he wanted her to hear exactly that and nothing more. "You're a strange kind of man to be found in these mountains alone," she said. "Most men up here are strange in one way or another. It's why we're up here outside." The wind threw itself against the shutters like it wanted in, and the fire popped and hissed. And for the first time since she'd woken, Clara let her shoulders come down from around her ears, just slightly, just enough that the pain in her ribs eased a fraction. She still didn't trust him, but she set the glass down on the table beside the empty plate, and Silas Boone, watching from across the room, said nothing at all about it, and went right back to his mending. The days that followed fell into something like a rhythm, though Clara wouldn't have called it comfort. Not yet. The storm outside showed no sign of breaking. If anything, it worsened, snow piling against the shuttered windows until the cabin sat half buried. The world outside reduced to a wall of white and a wind that never stopped its long, low howl. Clara's legs came back to her slowly. By the second day, she could stand. By the third, she could cross the room without her knees buckling, though she still moved careful, still watched Silas Boone from the corner of her eye every moment he was near. She noticed things about him in that time. Small things. He never once raised his voice, not when she snapped at him for staring, which she did more than once out of pure nerves. Not when she accused him outright of planning to sell her back to Gideon Frost, a charge he neither confirmed nor denied, just let sit there in the air between them like smoke that would eventually clear on its own. She noticed, too, that he favored his left side, that he moved with a stiffness in the mornings that eased some by midday but never fully went away. That once, reaching up to bank the fire, he'd made a small sound, quick and sharp, cut off before it fully left his throat, and pressed a hand flat against his shoulder for just a moment before going on like nothing had happened. By the fourth night, she couldn't ignore it any longer. "You're hurt," she said. He was seated at the rough-hewn table, working through a length of rope, with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. And he didn't look up. "I'm fine. You've been favoring that shoulder since I woke up here. You winced just now stacking wood. That's not fine. That's an infection setting in. And if you let it go much longer, you're going to lose more than the use of that arm. Now he did look up. There was something in his face. Not quite surprise. More like a man recalculating a sum he thought he already had settled. You a doctor, an apothecary. Which in these mountains is close enough to the same thing, since there's no doctor for 80 miles that isn't drunk half the year. Silas was quiet a moment, then slow, like it cost him something. He reached up and unbuttoned the top of his shirt, pulling it back off his shoulder to show her. The wound was old, weeks old, maybe longer, a gunshot that had never been properly cleaned, the skin around it gone an angry red, swollen tight and shining. Clara's stomach turned at the sight of it, less from squeamishness and more from simple professional alarm. That should have killed you by now, she said. Didn't. It still might, if you keep ignoring it. She was already moving, already reaching for her satchel. The fear that had gripped her the first days in this cabin giving way, for the moment, to something more familiar. Work. A problem in front of her that she knew how to solve. Sit still. This is going to hurt. Wouldn't be much of a wound if it didn't. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She worked by firelight, cleaning the wound with alcohol that made him go rigid and silent, his jaw locked tight. But he never once pulled away, never once made her stop. She dug free a sliver of old fabric that had worked down into the wound, the source of half the infection, and stitched the worst of the tear closed with careful, practiced fingers, her hands moving steady, even as her mind raced with 100 questions she didn't yet dare ask. Up close like this, she could see the whole map of him, scars crossing scars, old bullet wounds gone silver with age, a knife scar along one rib. A man who had lived through more violence than most soldiers saw in a war. Whoever did this to you, she said, nodding at the fresh wound. Did you let them? No. Then how'd you take a bullet in the shoulder and just walk away from it without proper care? Silas was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire. Wasn't in a position to ask for care, he said finally. Man who shoots you generally isn't inclined to patch you up after. Who shot you? Man I used to ride with, Gideon Frost. Clara's hands went still over the wound. She looked up at him then, really looked. And something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the winter outside. You know him, she said. Not a question. Rode under him, years back, before he traded his uniform for a silver mine and decided he liked killing men for money better than killing them for a flag. Then you know what he's capable of. I know exactly what he's capable of. Better than most. Clara sat back on her heels, her hands trembling now, for reasons that had nothing to do with cold or fear of the man in front of her. There's a wanted poster with my face on it, she said. $500. No questions asked. You found me half dead in the snow, and you brought me inside anyway. Why? Silas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rougher than before. Because $500 looked like everything I needed the moment I saw your face on that poster. Looked like the deed to this mountain. Clean and paid for, no more scraping. And now he looked at her. And for the first time since she'd woken in his cabin, Clara saw something in his eyes that wasn't calculation. Something closer to shame, though he'd never have called it that himself. Now I know what's in that satchel isn't stolen silver or some rich man's jewelry, he said. I know. It's the reason Gideon Frost wants you dead worse than he wants you alive. Only he needs you alive first, to make you hand over whatever it is you know. Clara's grip on the needle in her hand tightened. How do you know that? Because that's how the man operates. Always has. He doesn't spend $500 on a whim. He spends it because something's worth more to him than the money. And the only thing worth more to Gideon Frost than money is making sure nobody ever finds out how he makes it. The fire popped. Outside, the wind screamed past the shutters, and somewhere in the walls of the cabin, timber groaned under the weight of snow. Clara made her decision then, fast the way she made most of her decisions, trusting her gut before her mind could talk her out of it. It's a ledger, she said. Accounting books, on the surface. Underneath that, it's proof. Proof that Gideon Frost collapsed a mine shaft on purpose. On a day, he knew 40 men were working inside it, because paying out their wages for the quarter would have cost him more than the men were worth to him alive. Irish men, Cornish men, men nobody in that town would go looking for. Silas's face had gone very still. I encrypted it, Clara went on, using formulas, chemical notations, things only someone with real apothecary training could read straight through. Gideon knows the ledger exists. He doesn't know how to read what's inside it. That's why he wants me alive. I'm the only key he's got. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Silas Boone reached up and, wincing only slightly at the fresh stitches in his shoulder, pulled his shirt back up over the wound. Well, he said, that changes the arithmetic sum. Clara studied his face, searching for the man who'd nearly sold her out for $500 just days before. Does it change it in my favor, she asked, or against it? Silas Boone looked at her a long moment, the firelight throwing deep shadows across the scars on his face. Guess we'll find out, he said, before this storm breaks. The knock came on the 6th day, in the gray hour just after dawn, when the wind had finally dropped enough that a man could hear something other than his own thoughts. Silas was up before the second knock finished sounding, moving fast for a man his size, crossing the cabin in 3 long strides and pulling Clara up from where she sat mending a torn glove by the fire. Pinkertons, he said, low, 2 of them, maybe 3. Judging by the tracks, I'd guess, came up the east trail. Clara's blood went cold. How do you know? Because I know what a Pinkerton's knock sounds like. Confident, like they already own whatever's behind the door. He was moving as he spoke, crossing to the far corner of the cabin, kneeling, prying up a section of floorboard Clara hadn't even known was there. Underneath, a shallow cache, barely large enough for a person to fold themselves into. Get in, he said. Clara hesitated only a second before doing exactly that, curling herself down into the dark. Cramped space, her heart hammering so loud, she was certain the men outside would hear it through the walls. Silas fitted the floorboard back into place above her, and through the thin gap between boards, she could see nothing but a sliver of firelight and the shadow of his boots crossing the room. The knock came a 3rd time, harder now. Boone, a voice called through the door, flat. Official, open up. She heard the door open, heard the wind gust in, cold air, reaching even down into her hiding place. Heard boots on the wood floor. 2 sets, maybe 3. Morning, Silas said, unhurried, same voice he used for everything. We're looking for a woman, the Pinkerton said. Ran off from Silverton near 2 weeks back. Word is, she came up this way. Ain't seen a woman up here since the last time I rode down for supplies, Silas said. Ain't seen much of anybody. Matter of fact, storms kept the whole mountain quiet. A pause. Clara held her breath, pressed flat against the cold dirt beneath the floorboards, listening to her own pulse pound in her ears. Mr. Frost is offering good money for information, the second voice said. Real good money. A man living up here alone, scraping by, that kind of money could set him up for good. I appreciate the thought, Silas said, and something in his voice had gone flat and hard in a way Clara hadn't heard yet. But I told you, ain't seen her. There was a long silence. Clara's whole body had gone rigid, every muscle locked, waiting for the sound of the floorboards being torn up, for hands reaching down into the dark to drag her out into the light. Instead, she heard boots moving toward the door. There's a gorge trail, Silas said, before they'd fully turned to go. Runs down along the east ridge. Faster route back to Silverton than the way you came up. If you're wanting to beat the next storm rolling in, though I'd be careful on it, ice builds up thick along that stretch this time of year. Lost a mule on it myself. 2 winters back, obliged, the first voice said, and then the door was closing, and boots were crunching away through the snow, and the wind rushed back in to fill the silence they left behind. Clara didn't move for a long time after. Didn't dare to. Not until she heard Silas kneel down and pry the floorboard free, his big hand reaching down to help her up out of the dark. She came up trembling, and not from the cold this time. That gorge trail, she said. You sent them onto ice. Silas's face gave nothing away. I did. That's a death sentence. Man who comes up a mountain looking to drag a woman back down it to be murdered, Silas said, isn't owed the truth about safe trails. Clara stared at him, at this massive, scarred man who 2 weeks ago had carried her inside purely for the bounty on her head, who days ago had been ready to hand her over the moment it suited him. "Why?" she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "Why throw away $500 for a woman you don't even know?" Silas was quiet a long moment, staring at the floorboard he'd just fitted back into place, like the answer to her question was written somewhere in the grain of the wood. "Because handing a woman over to men who mean to kill her isn't a business transaction," he said finally. "It's murder, same as pulling the trigger myself. I've done plenty in my life I'm not proud of." Wasn't about to add that to the list. Something in Clara's chest, some tight-guarded thing she'd been carrying since the moment she woke in this cabin, came loose, just slightly at that. Outside, the wind had finally begun to quiet, the storm easing its grip on the mountain. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara let herself believe, just a little, that maybe she wasn't a prisoner here after all. The morning after the Pinkertons rode off toward the gorge, Silas woke Clara before first light. "Get dressed warm," he said. "We're going outside." Clara sat up on the cot, blinking against the gray dawnlight coming through the shutter cracks. Outside for what? For a lesson? She didn't ask again. Something in the flat certainty of his voice told her this wasn't a quest she was meant to argue with. And besides, 3 days shut up in that cabin had left her restless in a way she hadn't expected. A kind of itch under her skin that even the danger outside couldn't quite outweigh. He handed her a coat, too big, clearly his own, and a pair of gloves that swallowed her hands whole. She pulled them on anyway, following him out into a morning so cold and so still, it felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. The snow had stopped falling sometime in the night. What was left behind was a world scrubbed white and silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the distant call of some bird Clara couldn't name. Silas led her to a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, maybe 40 yards from the cabin, and propped an old tin cup on top of it. Then he walked back to where she stood and held out his rifle. "Stock first." Clara looked at it like it might bite her. "I don't know how to use one of those." "I know. Then why hand it to me?" "'Cause that Pinkerton knock is going to come again," Silas said. "And next time it might not be men I can talk into taking the wrong trail. Next time, you might be the only thing standing between yourself and whoever Gideon Frost sends up this mountain. I'd rather you know what to do with a rifle than not." Clara took it from him, slow, surprised by the weight of it, the cold of the metal even through her gloves. "I've never held a gun in my life," she admitted. Figured as much. He came around behind her, and Clara felt her whole body go rigid at the closeness of him, though he made no move that could be called anything but instructional. He nudged her feet apart with the toe of his boot, adjusted the set of her shoulders with 2 fingers, light as anything. "Feet like this, wider than feels natural. You want your weight settled, not leaning. Why does it matter how I stand? Because that rifle's going to kick back against your shoulder the second you fire it. And if your feet aren't set right, it'll knock you clean off balance. Might even knock you down. A rifle doesn't care how determined you are if your stance is wrong." Clara adjusted her feet, feeling foolish, feeling also, underneath the foolishness, a small stubborn spark of interest. She had spent her whole life being told what a woman could and couldn't handle, couldn't lift, couldn't understand. And here was this enormous man treating the whole business like arithmetic, like something anybody could learn if they paid attention. "Now, bring it up," Silas said. "Slow, let the stock sit right here." He touched her shoulder, just below the collarbone. "Not out on your arm. Right against the bone, where it can push into something solid." She did as he said, the rifle wobbling in her grip, and he adjusted her elbow, her grip on the stock, patient the whole while, never once raising his voice at her mistakes. "Now look down the barrel. Line up the sight with that cup." Clara squinted one eye shut, the way she'd seen men do, and found the little metal notch. Found the cup sitting on the log beyond it. "When you're ready," Silas said, "squeeze. Don't yank. A yank'll pull your whole shot wide." She squeezed. The shot cracked out across the clearing, loud enough that Clara felt it in her teeth, and the recoil slammed back against her shoulder, hard enough to stagger her half a step. The cup didn't move. A puff of snow kicked up 10 feet to its left. Missed, she said, disgusted with herself. First shot. Most men miss their first shot, too. Silas reached over and adjusted her stance again. A fraction here, a fraction there. Try again. She missed the second time, too, and the third. By the fifth shot, her shoulder had gone tender, and her ears rang from the cracking report. But on the sixth, the cup jumped clean off the log and spun away into the snow. And Clara let out a sound of pure, astonished triumph that surprised even herself. "There it is," Silas said, and something in his voice, some small satisfaction he didn't bother hiding, made Clara turn and look at him. "You're not going to tell me it was luck." "Wasn't luck. You corrected your own stance on that last one before I said a word. That's not luck. That's learning." They worked through the morning that way, Clara's aim improving shot by shot, her confidence growing alongside it, in a way that had nothing to do with the rifle itself and everything to do with the fact that nobody, not once in her 29 years, had stood behind her and treated her capability as a foregone conclusion rather than a surprise. "Why are you really teaching me this?" she asked, during a lull while Silas reloaded. He considered the question a moment, the way he seemed to consider most things, turning it over before answering. "A bullet doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. Clara," he said, "doesn't care if you're big or small, strong or weak. It only cares if you've got the steady hand to survive what's coming for you. I've known men twice your size who couldn't hit a barn from 10 paces because they never bothered learning how their own hands worked. I've known women who could outshoot half a cavalry regiment because somebody bothered to teach them young. And you figure I need that steady hand now. I figure you're the one carrying proof that could hang Gideon Frost. And Gideon Frost has more money and more men than either of us. That math doesn't favor you sitting helpless behind me while I do the deciding for both of us. It favors you knowing how to defend yourself, same as any man would." Clara looked down at the rifle in her hands, still warm from firing, and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect. The plain, unadorned kind that asked nothing and offered nothing except the truth of a person's ability. "Teach me to reload it," she said. Silas almost smiled at that. "Almost. That's the spirit," he said, and knelt down beside her in the snow to show her how. They worked until midday, until Clara's shoulder ached in earnest, and her hands had gone half numb despite the gloves. And Silas finally called a halt, telling her that a person learning something new needed rest as much as practice, that overworking a lesson dulled it same as overworking a blade dulled its edge. They were walking back toward the cabin, rifle slung now over Clara's own shoulder rather than his, when the first sound reached them. Distant, a low rumble, felt as much as heard, rolling up through the ground itself. Silas stopped dead. "What was that?" Clara asked. "Gunfire," he said, already turning toward the sound, his whole body gone tense and alert, down in the lower pass. And that. The second sound came a moment later, and this one Clara felt in her chest before her mind caught up to naming it. A deep groaning roar, building fast. The sound of something enormous breaking loose. "Avalanche," Silas said. They ran the lower pass. When they reached it, had changed entirely. From the trail Clara remembered walking 2 weeks before. A wall of snow and broken timber lay across what had been open ground, still settling. Small slides of powder sifting down from the disturbed slope above and scattered across the face of it. Dark shapes against the white. Men, struggling, some still, some flailing weakly, buried to varying depths in the wreckage. Clara didn't think. She was moving before Silas had even finished cursing under his breath, scrambling down the slope toward the nearest dark shape, her hands already digging. "Clara, wait. They'll die if we wait," she called back over her shoulder, and kept digging. Silas caught up to her in 3 long strides, cursing the whole way, because she was right, and because being right didn't make the situation any less dangerous. Digging out survivors this close to the main pass, In plain open ground meant anyone still watching from above. Any Pinkerton who hadn't taken that gorge trail after all would see them clear as anything. But a man was dying under the snow, 6 feet from where Clara knelt. And Silas Boone found that some kinds of arithmetic simply didn't hold up against the sight of another human being suffocating in front of him. He dug in beside her. They worked fast, the two of them, pulling frantic handfuls of snow away from a young man's face first, clearing his mouth and nose so he could breathe, then working down to free his arms, his chest, enough that he could help pull himself the rest of the way free. He came up coughing, gasping, his face gone nearly blue, and Clara held him upright while he retched up snow and caught his breath. "There's more," the young man managed. Between coughs, his accent was thick, Irish, the words tumbling out fast. "My brother, he was right beside me." Silas was already moving toward the next dark shape in the snow. They found 6 men in all, buried at varying depths, and pulled 5 of them out alive. Clara worked with a focus she hadn't known she possessed. Her apothecary training taking over where panic might otherwise have set in, checking each man for injury, packing snow against a broken arm to slow the swelling, pressing her scarf against a gash on another man's scalp. The 6th man they found too late. Silas dug him free with the same urgency he'd shown for the others. But the moment the man's face came clear of the snow, Clara knew from the stillness of him, from the particular gray cast of his skin, that there would be no reviving this one. Silas knew it too. He stopped digging, sat back on his heels in the snow, and was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that Clara would remember long after that day had passed into memory. He removed his hat. He reached down and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible in hands so large and so scarred, crossed the dead man's arms over his chest, straightened his collar, brushed the snow from his still face. Then he walked a short distance to where a young pine grew at the edge of the slide, broke off a small branch, and laid it across the man's chest. The young Irish man Clara had first pulled free watched this with tears cutting tracks down his snow-reddened face. "That's my cousin," he said. "Quiet. Tommy. We came up together from County Cork 3 years back." "I'm sorry," Silas said. And there was nothing performed in it, nothing said for show. He didn't die for nothing. You and the others are alive because of what he was running from. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like enough right now. "What were you all running from?" Clara asked. Once the immediate crisis had passed, and the surviving men had gathered themselves enough to speak. The Irishman, whose name turned out to be Patrick, wiped his face with the back of a snow-crusted glove. "Frost's mine," he said. We heard talk, some of the men saying Frost meant to collapse the number 3 shaft on purpose, blame it on bad timbering, avoid paying out the quarter's wages to the men working the deep vein. We didn't wait around to find out if the talk was true. Figured better to freeze running than to drown or burn waiting to see. Clara went very still at that. "The number 3 shaft," she said. "That's the one in my ledger." Silas looked at her sharp. "You mean he's done it already?" "Whatever's in that book. It's already happened." "I thought it was a threat," Clara said, her voice gone small. "Something he was planning." "I didn't know." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "These men ran because they knew. Because word got out before it could happen, and they got out in time." "Then you understand now," Silas said, "exactly what that ledger is worth, and exactly why Gideon Frost will burn this whole mountain down looking for it. Patrick and the other survivors. Once they'd caught their breath and warmed themselves somewhat by the small fire Silas built right there in the snow, insisted on continuing east, toward the nearest town with a proper doctor, rather than risk bringing more trouble down on the cabin that had already sheltered one fugitive. Silas gave them what supplies he could spare, directions to the safest trail, and watched them go with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "You could have stayed hidden," she said. "Once the men had disappeared over the ridge, nobody would have blamed you for staying out of sight, letting them dig themselves out. They'd have died. Some of them, maybe, but you'd have kept us both safer." Silas was quiet a moment, staring at the spot where Tommy's small grave marker of pine still lay against the disturbed snow. There's a kind of safety that isn't worth having, he said finally. Man who watches other men die so he can keep his own hide unbothered isn't safe. He's just rotted through in a different way than the men he let die. They walked back to the cabin as the light began to fail, both of them soaked through and shaking with cold. The adrenaline of the rescue draining out of them and leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Clara's hands had gone numb somewhere in the digging, and by the time they reached the cabin door, she could barely make her fingers work the latch. Silas noticed before she said a word about it. "You're worse off than you're letting on," he said, steering her toward the fire, peeling the wet gloves from her hands himself when her fingers wouldn't cooperate. "I'm fine," Clara said, though even to her own ears, the words came out thin, unconvincing. "You've been in wet clothes and freezing wind half the day, digging in snow up past your elbows," Silas said. "That's not fine. That's the start of something a lot worse than fine." By full dark, Clara understood exactly how right he was. The fever came on fast, faster than anything Clara had ever treated in another person, faster than she knew how to fight in herself. It started as a deep shiver that wouldn't stop no matter how close she huddled to the fire. And by the time Silas noticed her teeth chattering hard enough to hear across the room, it had already progressed to something far more dangerous. Her skin, when he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, burned hot despite the shivering. "Clara, I'm fine," she said again, though her words had begun to slur at the edges. And when she tried to stand from her chair by the fire, her legs folded under her like they'd forgotten their purpose entirely, Silas caught her before she hit the floor. He carried her to the cot, and from that point forward, for 3 days, the giant of a man who had once weighed her life against a bag of bounty money did not leave her side. The fever climbed through that first night, until Clara's skin burned so hot, it frightened even a man who had faced down gunfights without flinching. She thrashed in half-sleep, muttering things that made no sense, names Silas didn't know. Fragments of some ledger she seemed to be reciting from memory, even in her delirium. He soaked cloths in melted snow water and laid them across her forehead, her throat, her wrists, changing them out every time they warmed, which in the grip of that fever seemed like every few minutes. He had never cared for a sick person in his life, had never had cause to. The men he'd hunted didn't get nursed back to health, and the men he'd ridden with in his soldiering days handled their own wounds or died of them. No fuss made either way, but some instinct in him, buried under years of hardened solitude, knew what to do anyway, and he followed it without questioning where it had come from. By the second day, Clara had stopped thrashing and gone instead into a heavy, unmoving stillness that frightened Silas worse than the thrashing had. He spooned broth past her lips a few drops at a time, tilting her head just enough that she could swallow without choking. And when she wouldn't wake even to that, he sat beside the cot and held her hand and talked to her, low and steady, about nothing in particular. About the mountain, about the elk he'd been tracking the day he found her, about anything at all, because the silence in that cabin with her, lying so still, had become unbearable to sit through without some sound to fill it. "You don't get to die in my cabin," he told her, somewhere in the gray hours of that second night, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Not after all that. Not after digging half-dead men out of an avalanche with your bare hands. You hear me? That's not how this ends." She didn't answer, didn't stir, but Silas kept talking anyway, kept holding her hand, kept pressing cool cloths to her burning skin, because it was the only thing left that felt like doing something, instead of simply waiting to see what the fever decided to do with her. By the third night, exhaustion had worn Silas down to something thin and hollow-eyed. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since the fever started, had barely eaten, had done nothing but tend the fire and tend Clara, and watch her chest rise and fall with a fear that had settled deep into his bones and refused to leave. It was somewhere past midnight, the cabin dark except for the low glow of banked coals, when Clara's fever finally broke. Silas felt it before he understood it, her hand in his going from burning to merely warm, her breathing easing into something slower, steadier. He leaned forward. pressing the back of his hand to her forehead, and found it damp with sweat, but blessedly. Finally, cool. He hadn't realized how tired he was until that fear lifted. His head dropped forward, chin nearly to his chest, and without meaning to, without deciding to, Silas Boone fell asleep sitting beside her cot, still holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping either of them anchored to the world. Clara woke sometime near dawn to find him there, slumped in the chair beside her, his big frame folded at an angle that couldn't have been comfortable, his hand wrapped around hers, like he'd forgotten to let go. Like some part of him, even in sleep, refused to release his grip on her. The firelight had died down to embers, casting the barest orange glow across his face, softening for a moment the hard lines and scars that usually made him look carved from the mountain itself. Clara lay still for a long while, just looking at him. She understood, in that quiet, gray hour, something she hadn't let herself understand before. This man, who had first seen her as $500 and nothing more, had sat beside her for 3 days and nights, tending her like she was the only thing in the world worth tending. Nobody had ever done that for her before. Not her father, who died when she was 12, and left her to fend for herself in a mining town that chewed up orphaned girls without blinking. Not the men who'd courted her in Silverton, all of them wanting something from her. Her hands, her intellect, her body. None of them ever once simply sitting beside her and asking nothing at all in return. Her chest ached with the weight of it. This realization that she had spent 29 years building walls so high and so thick that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone tear one down without even trying, without even meaning to. Tears came before she could stop them, hot and sudden, spilling down her cheeks in the gray morning light. Silas stirred at the small sound of her crying, his eyes opening slow, still thick with sleep, and then going sharp and alert the moment he registered she was awake. Clara, he sat up fast, his hand tightening around hers. You're awake. The fevers broke. She nodded, unable yet to speak, her whole body shaking with the effort of holding back a flood of feeling she had no practice managing. You're crying, Silas said, and there was such open confusion in his voice, such a complete lack of understanding for what to do with a weeping woman, that under any other circumstance, Clara might have laughed. You stayed, she managed, her voice thick and cracked. 3 days. You never left. Where else would I have gone? Anywhere. You could have gone anywhere. Nobody would have thought less of you for it. I was a stranger to you 3 weeks ago. Less than that. Silas was quiet a moment, his thumb moving slow and absent across the back of her hand, a motion Clara didn't think he was even fully aware of making. Wasn't a stranger by the time the fever took you, he said. Hadn't been for a while. Clara's tears came harder at that, her hand tightening around his, and something in her chest that had been locked tight since she was 12 years old, since the day she'd learned that nobody stayed, that everybody eventually wanted something, or left, or both, cracked wide open. Stop, she said, though it wasn't him she meant to stop, not really. It was the feeling itself, this overwhelming tide of being cared for, being seen, being tended by hands that asked for nothing in return. Stop, it's too much. Silas rose from his chair, slow, careful of his still healing shoulder, and gathered her up into his arms with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man built like a mountain. Clara buried her face against his chest and wept in earnest now, all the fear and grief and loneliness of the past weeks pouring out of her at once. And Silas held her through it, his face pressed into the crook of her neck, saying nothing, offering nothing except the solid, unmoving fact of his presence. When her tears finally slowed, when the shaking in her shoulders eased into something quieter, Silas pulled back just enough to look at her, his scarred face inches from hers, his eyes holding something raw and unguarded that she had not seen in him before. You drive me out of my mind, he growled, low, like the words had been dragged up from somewhere he'd kept locked away for years. And Clara, sitting there in the gray dawn light, with her defenses in ruins around her, found that, for the first time since she'd fled Silverton, with a ledger full of dead men's names, She wasn't afraid of what came next at all. The days after Clara's fever broke settled into something Silas hadn't known in years. Something close to peace. Patrick and the other survivors from the avalanche had made it safely east, according to word that filtered up through a trapper who passed within shouting distance of the cabin one clear morning, trading news for a sack of coffee beans. The federal marshal's office in Denver had apparently taken an interest in the collapsed shaft, though nothing official had come of it yet. No arrests, no summons, just a slow grinding start to something that might, given enough time, become justice. Clara grew stronger each day. Color came back into her face. She took to helping Silas with small chores around the cabin, mending, cooking, organizing her satchel of medicines into some kind of order after weeks of chaos. And Silas found himself watching her at these small tasks with an attention he didn't fully understand and didn't try too hard to explain. They didn't speak of what had happened the morning her fever broke. Not directly, but something had shifted between them, settled into a new shape, and neither of them seemed inclined to disturb it by naming it out loud. It was a Tuesday, or what Silas guessed was a Tuesday. Days having lost most of their meaning up on the mountain when Patrick came back. He came alone on foot, moving fast despite the deep snow, and the look on his face when Silas spotted him, cresting the ridge, told him, before a single word was spoken, that something had gone badly wrong. "Get inside," Silas told Clara, already reaching for his rifle. "What is it?" "Don't know yet." But that's not a man moving like good news. Patrick reached the cabin, breathless, his face gone gray with more than cold. "Frost," he managed between gasps. "He's coming. Tonight. Maybe tomorrow at the latest." "He knows where you are." Silas's jaw went tight. "How?" Patrick wouldn't meet his eyes at first. When he finally did, there was a raw kind of shame in them that told Silas most of what he needed to know before the words came out. "One of the men," Patrick said. "Denny. His family's back in County Clare, near starving. We've had letters. He's been sending every dollar he can scrape together, and it's still not enough. Frost's men found him in town, offered him silver, more than Denny's seen in his whole life, just to say where the cabin sits. And he took it. He's got 4 children," Patrick said, his voice cracking. "A wife with a bad chest. He didn't do it for greed, Silas. He did it because he's drowning, and Frost threw him a rope made of silver. And a drowning man doesn't always stop to ask what the rope's attached to." Silas said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the tree line, at the gray sky pressing down over the ridge. "How many men is Frost bringing?" "Word is 6, maybe more." "When?" "Could be tonight if they push hard." "Tomorrow at the latest." Silas nodded slow, already turning over the shape of what needed to happen next, already counting supplies. Angles the few defenses a single cabin in the mountains could offer against 6 armed men. "Thank you for the warning," he told Patrick. "Now get back down that mountain and stay clear of this place. Whatever happens here isn't yours to carry." Patrick hesitated. "I could stay. Help you fight." "You've got a cousin buried in the snow because of this fight already," Silas said, not unkindly. "That's enough cost paid by your family. Go." Patrick went, though it was plain from the set of his shoulders that leaving cost him something too. Inside the cabin, Clara had heard enough through the door to understand the shape of what was coming. "He knows," she said. When Silas came back inside, "He knows. Then we run." Silas shook his head, already moving to check the rifle, the shells, the few defenses the cabin offered. "Running gets us caught in open country with 6 armed men behind us and nowhere to make a stand. Better to hold ground here, where I know every angle of approach, every place a man might try to come at us from." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. It's just clearer than the alternative." He looked at her then, steady, serious. "You still remember what I taught you with that rifle?" "I remember." "Then get it. We've got maybe a day, maybe less, to get ready for whatever's coming." They spent that day working with a grim, focused efficiency neither of them had time to feel frightened through. Silas reinforced the shutters, angled furniture to give cover near the windows, checked every shell and every blade in the cabin twice over. Clara laid out her medical supplies where they'd be quick to reach. bandages and alcohol, and the small tools of her trade arranged with the same careful precision she brought to encrypting a ledger full of dead men's names. Night fell early, the way it did in the mountains that time of year, and with it came a stillness that felt less like peace and more like held breath. They didn't come that night. They came the next morning, just past dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain, and the cold had that particular bite that came before a break in weather. Silas heard them before he saw them. Boots in snow. Careful but not careful enough. The particular creak of leather that meant men in numbers. Men trying to move quiet and not quite managing it. They're here, he told Clara, low, and she was already moving to the position they'd planned, near the window on the north wall, rifle steady in her hands. The first shot came, without warning, shattering through the front window in a spray of glass, and Silas threw himself sideways, pulling Clara down and away from the line of fire, even as more shots followed, thudding into the log walls. Splintering wood, he returned fire. 2 shots through the broken window, and heard a man cry out somewhere in the tree line, though whether hit or just startled, he couldn't say. How many? Clara called over the ringing in her ears. Can't tell yet, more than I'd like. The exchange went on for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Gunfire cracking through the cold morning air. Snow kicking up where bullets struck wide. Silas moved from window to window, keeping low, keeping his shots controlled and purposeful in a way that spoke of years of practice, of a man who'd done this kind of work before, and hated every second of it. It was during a lull in the shooting, a brief pause while the attackers repositioned, that Silas made his mistake. He rose to check the angle from the east window, exposing himself for just a half-second longer than he should have. And the shot that came through the shattered glass caught him high in the shoulder. The same shoulder Clara had stitched weeks before, and spun him hard against the wall. Silas, he went down to one knee, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. But even as he fell, his body twisted to put himself between the window and where Clara knelt, his good arm coming up to shield her, even as he went down. I'm fine, he ground out, though the words came through gritted teeth. You are not fine. You've been shot. Wounds not the kind that stops a man from finishing a fight. He forced himself back up, rifle still gripped in his good hand, blood running down his arm in a way that made Clara's stomach turn. But his aim didn't waver when the next shape moved through the tree line, and his shot dropped the man before he could fire. The gunfire slowed, then stopped altogether, and in the sudden silence that followed, a new voice called out from beyond the tree line, cold and controlled in a way that raised the hair on the back of Clara's neck. Boone. Silas's whole body went rigid at the sound of it. That's Frost, he said, low, to Clara himself, not just his hired men. You've got something of mine, Boone Gideon Frost called out, and a woman who's caused me a great deal of expense and inconvenience. I'd like both returned. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, and I confess I've grown tired of the hard way this morning. Silas didn't answer right off. He was doing the math, the same cold arithmetic that had once told him a bounty was worth more than a stranger's life. Except now the numbers ran in an entirely different direction, and there was no version of this that ended with him handing Clara over. Come in and get her yourself. Gideon, Silas finally called back. See how that goes for you. There was a pause, and then, slower this time, the sound of boots approaching, and the front door of the cabin, already hanging half-broken on its hinges from the gunfire, was kicked the rest of the way open. Gideon Frost stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 remaining men, their weapons raised. He was not what Clara had expected, not some hulking brute like the rumors suggested, but a lean, precise man, silver-haired, dressed too well for the mountains, with cold, pale eyes that swept the cabin's interior, with the same detached calculation a man might use assessing livestock. Silas Boone, Gideon said, almost fond, the way a man might greet an old friend he'd once trusted and now found merely useful again. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes. Should have known you'd play the hero for this one. Wasn't playing, Silas said, still on his feet, despite the blood soaking through his shirt, his rifle steady even now. Gideon's eyes moved to Clara, and something in his expression sharpened. Hungry and cold at once, Miss Hayes. You've caused me an extraordinary amount of trouble for a woman who once mixed cough remedies for minors' children. His gaze flicked to the satchel, visible near the hearth. I trust that contains what I've come for. Clara stood slowly, deliberately positioning herself between Gideon and Silas, whose wound had left him weakened despite his refusal to show it. It contains proof that you murdered 40 men, she said, to avoid paying them what they were owed. It contains a book of numbers, Gideon said. That means nothing to anyone who can't read your particular brand of code, which is precisely why you're going to translate it for me, right now. Or I'm going to have my men put a bullet in Mr. Boone here, starting with his other shoulder and working from there until you find your voice. Clara's heart hammered, but her mind, trained through years of careful, methodical work, stayed clear. You're going to shoot him regardless, she said, whether I translate it or not. Men like you don't leave loose ends breathing. You wound me with your cynicism. I know exactly what you are. Gideon, I've read your own handwriting describing 40 men as an acceptable loss against a quarter's wages. There's nothing you could say now that would surprise me. Gideon's cold eyes narrowed slightly. Then let's dispense with pretense, he said. The cipher key. Now Clara held his gaze steady. I already sent it, she said, 3 weeks ago. Mailed to the federal marshal's office in Denver, along with a full account of everything I know about the number 3 shaft. By now, it's likely already in his hands. Whatever you do to me here changes nothing about what's already set in motion. Something flickered across Gideon's face, the first real crack in his composure since he'd walked through the door. You're lying, am I? Ask yourself something. Gideon, why would I keep the only copy of proof against you here, on my person, in a cabin you knew how to find? I encrypted that ledger months ago. I've had ample time to send copies wherever I pleased. Clara let the silence stretch a moment before continuing. You're not here to retrieve evidence. You're here because you're afraid. And fear makes men reckless. Gideon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara thought she'd pushed too hard, that his next words would be an order to his men to fire. Instead, she reached slowly for the satchel by the hearth, moving with deliberate care under the watchful guns of Gideon's men, and drew out the ledger itself, holding it up. Since we're past pretending, she said, let's discuss what's actually written in here, not just the collapsed shaft. There's more. Gideon, pages and pages more. I don't care to hear it. I imagine your men might, though she opened the ledger to a page near the back, one she'd memorized weeks ago during long nights of careful decryption, and began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the guns still leveled at her chest. March, page recording payroll adjustments for the Deep Vein crew, below the wage figures. A private notation, in Gideon's own hand. Quote, the Cornish and Irish crews working the number 3 vein are to be considered expendable once the vein plays out. Cost of severance exceeds value of continued employment. Recommend structural incident to resolve before quarter's end, avoiding wage payout entirely. End quote. The 2 men flanking Gideon exchanged a glance, and Clara, watching closely, saw something shift in their expressions. Uncertainty. The first crack of doubt in men who had likely been told they were simply here to retrieve stolen property, not to discover they themselves might be considered similarly expendable once their usefulness ran its course. There's more, Clara said, turning another page, a later entry, discussing hired security. Quote, once the Denver contract closes, current security personnel will no longer be required at present numbers. Recommend reduction in force-through means that avoid severance obligations. End quote. That's enough, Gideon snapped, but his voice had lost some of its cold command. Is it? Clara said, looking directly at the 2 men beside him now. Because it sounds to me like Gideon Frost has a well-established habit of resolving inconvenient debts through structural incidents rather than through paying what's owed. I wonder which of you gentlemen he's planning to resolve once this particular job concludes. The silence that followed stretched long and taut. The crackling of the hearth fire, the only sound in the cabin. Then, slow, deliberate. One of the two men lowered his rifle. "Denny told me you were straight with him," the man said, looking at Silas rather than Gideon. "Said you could have turned him in for that gorge trail lie, and didn't. Said you're not a man who deals crooked." "I try not to be," Silas said. The man's eyes moved to Gideon. Hard now, calculating in a way that mirrored his employer's own coldness turned back against him. "Is it true?" he asked. "What's written in that book? About us?" Gideon's composure cracked fully then, his cold eyes darting between his own men, between the leveled rifles, no longer quite so certain in their aim. "Don't be fools," he said. "She's manipulating you." Twisting words to save her own skin, "Read the next page," the second man said to Clara, ignoring Gideon entirely now. "The one about security personnel." Word for word, Clara did, slow and clear, and watched both men's faces harden with something that went beyond doubt now into cold recognition. "We're supposed to get paid out next month," the first man said, quiet. "Full contract, he told us. Guess now I understand why he kept pushing the date back." The click of a rifle hammer being drawn back sounded then, sharp in the tense silence of the cabin, and every head turned toward the sound. It wasn't aimed at Silas. It wasn't aimed at Clara. Gideon Frost's own hired men had turned their weapons on him. "Now hold on," Gideon said, his voice climbing toward something close to panic, for the first time since he'd walked through that broken door. "This is exactly the kind of hysteria a clever woman generates when she's cornered. Think clearly, both of you." "I am thinking clearly," the first man said. "Clearer than I have in months. Matter of fact." The standoff held there, taut and fragile. Gideon Frost caught between his own turned guns, and the rifle Silas still held, despite his wounded shoulder, and Clara standing steady with the ledger open in her hands. The proof of everything laid bare in the cold morning light filtering through the shattered window. It was in that suspended moment, with nobody quite certain which way the next second would break, that a new sound reached them all. Horses, several, moving fast, coming up the trail from the direction of the main pass. "Marshal's office," a voice called out. "Official and carrying. Lay down your weapons, all of you, and come out with hands raised." Gideon Frost's face went the color of old ash. The two Pinkerton men lowered their weapons without further hesitation, stepping back from Gideon with the particular haste of men eager to demonstrate whose side they'd landed on before it mattered which side had won. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief, though she didn't let it show. Not until the marshal himself, a broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache and a badge that caught the morning light, stepped through the broken doorway with 4 deputies at his back. "Miss Hayes," the marshal said, removing his hat despite the tension still thick in the room. "I received your letter 3 weeks past. Took some doing to organize men enough to make this ride. But I'd say we've arrived at a fitting moment." "You received it," Clara said, something in her chest loosening at the confirmation. The bluff she'd offered Gideon having turned out, against all odds, to be entirely true. "Word for word as you wrote it. And I'll say, the encryption gave my clerk fits for the better part of a week. But once he cracked it, there wasn't a man in my office who didn't want to ride up here immediately." The marshal's eyes moved to Gideon Frost, cold and final. "Gideon Frost, you're under arrest for the murder of 40 men in the collapse of the number 3 shaft, and for whatever additional charges we uncover once we've had proper time with that ledger." Gideon's composure had entirely collapsed by then, his cold eyes darting toward the door, toward any avenue of escape. But the deputies closed around him fast, and within minutes he was in irons, his silver tongue reduced to nothing but useless protests as they led him out into the snow. Silas finally allowed himself to sag against the wall once the danger had fully passed, his wounded shoulder finally demanding the attention he'd refused it through the whole ordeal. Clara was at his side in an instant, her medical training taking over, cutting away his shirt to examine the wound with hands that shook now. Finally, with the fear she hadn't let herself feel while the guns were still raised. "You could have died," she said, her voice cracking. "Didn't, though," Silas said, wincing as she pressed a clean cloth against the wound. Seems to be something of a pattern with me. That's not funny. Wasn't trying to be funny. Was trying to distract you from how much this is about to hurt when you clean it properly. Clara laughed despite herself, a wet, relieved sound, and pressed her forehead briefly against his good shoulder before getting back to the business of tending his wound. With the same steady focus she'd shown, treating his shoulder that first week. A lifetime ago, it now felt, when she'd been a frightened stranger holding broken glass in his cabin. "It's over," she said, once the wound was cleaned and bound, "isn't it?" Silas looked at her a long moment, something settling in his weathered face that Clara hadn't seen there before. Something like relief, and underneath it, something that looked almost like hope. "Feels that way," he said, for the first time in longer than I care to admit. Outside, the marshal's men were loading Gideon Frost onto a horse, his protests growing fainter as they led him away down the mountain, and the morning light, breaking fully now through scattering clouds, fell across the snow in a way that made the whole ruined clearing look, for a moment, almost peaceful. The marshal lingered a while after his men had ridden ahead with their prisoner, accepting a cup of coffee Clara made despite her shaking hands. And it was over that coffee that he mentioned, almost in passing, the matter of the bounty. $500, he said, still stands, officially, far as the county's concerned, for information leading to Miss Hayes's whereabouts, given the circumstances. I'd imagine that bounty's rightfully yours, Mr. Boone, seeing as you're the one who found her. Silas was quiet a long moment, staring into his own coffee cup. "Give it to the miners' families instead," he said finally. "The ones who lost husbands and sons and brothers in that shaft. They're the ones owed something out of all this, not me." The marshal studied him a moment, something like respect, settling into his weathered face. "That's a generous offer, given how hard a winter you've likely had up here." "Wasn't looking to get rich off dead men's misfortune," Silas said. "Wasn't ever really looking for that, if I'm honest with myself. Just took me longer than it should have to remember it." Clara, listening from where she stood by the hearth, felt something warm settle through her chest at those words, warmer even than the coffee in her hands. The marshal left before midday, riding down the mountain with his prisoner and his deputies, leaving the cabin, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, entirely quiet and entirely safe. Silas and Clara stood together in the cabin doorway, watching the riders disappear down the trail, the snow around them finally beginning, in small persistent drips from the eaves, to show the first true signs of spring's approach. Spring came slow to the mountain, the way it always did at that altitude. Patches of bare earth appearing first in sheltered hollows before spreading gradually across the whole clearing. Snow retreating day by day until only the deepest drifts in the shadowed places still held on. Clara stayed through all of it. There had been no discussion of her leaving. Not really. No formal decision made in any conversation either of them could point to. She had simply stayed. First through the necessity of Silas's recovery. Then through the practical matter of helping him manage the cabin while his shoulder healed. And then somewhere in the slow unfolding weeks of that thaw, simply because neither of them wanted her to be anywhere else. Word had come up the mountain, carried by Patrick on one of his periodic visits, that Gideon Frost's trial had concluded in Denver. Swift and thorough, given the weight of evidence in Clara's ledger, and that he would spend the remainder of his considerably shortened life in a federal prison. His silver mine seized and its profits redirected, by court order, toward the families of the men who'd died in that collapsed shaft. Clara had wept upon hearing the news, not from grief this time, but from something closer to closure. The long months of fear and flight finally settling into something that resembled justice, however incomplete justice for the dead could ever truly be. "They'll never get their husbands back," she said to Silas, the evening the news arrived. "Their sons." "No amount of silver changes that." "No," Silas agreed. "But it changes what happens to their families now. Changes whether the widows starve or whether they've got something to build on. That matters, even if it doesn't undo what's already been lost." Clara had thought about that a long while, sitting beside him on the porch step in the thin evening light, watching the last patches of snow retreat from the yard. "I want to open an apothecary," she said finally. "Here, on the mountain, or close enough to it that folks from the mining towns could reach me without too hard a ride." Silas looked at her, something warm moving behind his usually guarded eyes. "There's good ground for it, down near the old trading post," he said. "Enough traffic passing through that you'd never want for patients. But, far enough removed, you wouldn't be swallowed up by any single town's troubles." "You'd want that?" Clara asked. "Living somewhere that sees traffic, after building this whole life specifically to avoid people." Silas considered the question with the same careful weight he gave most things. "Used to think solitude was the only safety worth having," he said. "Learned this winter that's not entirely true. Learned there's a kind of safety that comes from having somebody worth protecting, worth building something alongside. And that kind's worth a great deal more than simply being left alone." Clara reached over and took his hand, the same hand that had held hers steady through 3 days and nights of fever, and felt something settle deep and permanent in her chest. A feeling she no longer needed to name aloud for either of them to understand its full weight. They built the apothecary through the height of that summer, Silas doing the heavier carpentry with his healing shoulder, Clara organizing shelves and supplies with the same meticulous care she'd once used to encrypt a ledger full of dead men's names. Word spread, slow at first and then steadily, that there was a skilled apothecary set up near the old trading post, one who charged fair prices and turned nobody away for lack of funds. And travelers began making the detour specifically to see her. Miners and ranchers, and the occasional lost soul caught out by weather, much as Clara herself had once been. On the day the sign went up above the door, carved by Silas's own hands from a length of pine, "Hayes Apothecary," burned into the wood in careful, deliberate letters. Clara stood back to admire it, while Silas fixed it into place above the entrance. "You did good work on that," she said. "Had good reason to do it right." She watched him a long moment. This massive, scarred man who had once weighed her life against a bounty, who had transformed over one hard winter into someone who dug strangers free of an avalanche with his bare hands, who had held her through a fever with a tenderness she hadn't known existed in a man built like a mountain. "I love you," she said, simple and unadorned, the words costing her nothing anymore. Not after everything they'd survived together. Silas climbed down from the ladder, slow, and pulled her into arms that had once been strangers to her and now felt like the only home she needed. "Took you long enough to say it out loud," he said, though his voice had gone rough with feeling. "Took you long enough to earn it," Clara said, and kissed him there in the doorway of her new apothecary, with the mountain spring blooming green and gold around them, and the last traces of that hard winter finally, fully thawed away inside. The coffee Clara had left brewing on the stove filled the small building with warmth, and outside, travelers passing along the road toward the trading post would pause, in the months and years that followed, to admire the sign hanging above the apothecary door, and the giant quiet man often found sitting on its porch step, mending harness leather or teaching some young traveler's daughter the proper stance for holding a rifle steady, patient and unhurried, the way a man teaches something he believes every person deserves to know. They had turned a cold, isolated cabin into a sanctuary, and a hard winter into the beginning of everything that followed. And neither of them, watching the mountain bloom green around their new life together, ever once looked back with regret at the path that had brought them there. Silas Boone started this story as a man who'd already decided what he was worth. He'd hunted men for money. He'd built a wall of solitude so high around himself that he genuinely believed a woman freezing to death in the snow was worth exactly $500 and nothing more. That's not a villain talking. That's a man who got so tired of being disappointed by the world that he decided to stop expecting anything from it at all. A lot of us do that in smaller ways. We build our own version of that mountain cabin. We tell ourselves that keeping people out is the same thing as keeping ourselves safe. But here's the thing the story keeps showing you. Chapter after chapter. Every single time, Silas had a choice between the safe, cold, calculated option and the harder, riskier human one. Something in him reached for the human one anyway. He didn't send Clara back down that mountain to the Pinkertons. He didn't walk past those buried miners to protect his own hiding place. He didn't let his pride keep him sitting in that chair while she burned with fever 3 days straight. Every one of those moments cost him something. And every one of those moments is where he actually became who he was underneath all that armor. That's the real lesson here. Courage doesn't usually look like a gunfight. Most of the time, it looks exactly like what Silas did. It looks like choosing the harder kindness when the easier cruelty would cost you nothing. It looks like digging a stranger out of the snow when staying hidden would keep you safer. It looks like sitting beside someone through a fever with no guarantee they'll ever wake up just because leaving isn't something you can live with. And then there's Clara. I want you to notice something about her because it's easy to miss. She was never rescued in this story. Not once. Silas taught her to shoot, yes, but he didn't hand her power. He handed her the tools and then stepped back and let her build her own strength with them. When Gideon Frost had guns pointed at both of them in that final standoff, it wasn't Silas who talked their way out of it. It was Clara. Her mind, her nerve, her willingness to stand in front of a bleeding man and outthink someone far more dangerous than either of them. That's what real partnership looks like. Not a man saving a woman. Two people who each brought something the other one needed, and neither of them smaller for it. I also want to talk about Tommy for a second, and about Denny, because this story didn't let either of us look away from the cost of all this. Tommy died in that avalanche, a young man who ran because he was scared and desperate, and Silas took his hat off and laid a pine branch over his chest. His dignity doesn't stop mattering just because a man was poor or foreign or scared. And Denny, the miner who sold out their location for silver. That wasn't written as some cartoon betrayal. That was a man with 4 children and a sick wife, drowning, and somebody threw him a rope with strings attached. The story asks you to hold both of those truths at once. What Denny did put Silas and Clara in danger. And what drove him to it was a system that had already failed him long before Gideon Frost ever showed up with silver in his hand. That's really what this whole story is underneath the romance. It's about what happens when people who've been ground down by greed, by poverty, by loss, still choose to treat each other like they matter anyway. Silas giving up his bounty money to the miners' widows wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a man finally living according to what he already believed, instead of what fear had talked him into for years. So if you're taking one thing away from Silas and Clara's winter on that mountain, let it be this. The people who deserve your trust aren't the ones who never make you scared to open up. They're the ones who, when you finally do, sit beside you and hold on anyway. And the strength worth having isn't the kind that keeps everyone else out. It's the kind 2 people build together, standing on equal ground. Thank you for spending this time with me and with this story. If it meant something to you, tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and hit subscribe so we can go find the next one together. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.